The station was dying around him, and Sergeant Marcus Cole could hear it screaming. Metal groaned and twisted as another explosion ripped through the outer hull somewhere above his head, and the emergency lights flickered from white to red to darkness, before sputtering back to life again, and Marcus pressed himself against the wall as debris rained down from the ceiling. He had been separated from his squad for nearly 20 minutes now, and his radio produced nothing but static, no matter how many times he tried to reach them, and the last thing he had heard was Lieutenant Torres shouting about a hull breach in Section 7 before the signal cut out completely. 3 years of war against the Vethkai had taught Marcus many things, and one of them was that standing still meant dying, and so he kept moving through the twisted corridors of Kethra Station with his rifle raised and his heart pounding in his chest. The Vethkai were everywhere on the station, and they were hunting humans just as the humans were hunting them, and this battle had been raging for 6 hours with no end in sight, and both sides had taken terrible losses already. Marcus turned a corner and found himself in what looked like a civilian sector, and he cursed it under his breath, because this area should have been evacuated days ago when the first shots were fired, and instead he saw signs of habitation everywhere with personal belongings scattered across the floor and furniture overturned in panic. A sound made him freeze, and he raised his weapon toward a doorway marked with Vethkai symbols he could not read, and he waited with his finger on the trigger as his training demanded. Nothing came through the door. He should keep moving, and he knew this, and every survival instinct told him to find a way back to the Terran-controlled sections of the station before his luck ran out. But something made him step toward that doorway. Instead, the room beyond had been some kind of nursery, and Marcus understood this immediately. Even though the furniture was shaped wrong for human children and the colors were strange shades of purple and gray that hurt his eyes, and the ceiling was too low, and the air smelled like copper and something sweet he could not identify. Half the room had collapsed, and structural beams lay scattered across the floor, like broken bones, and emergency foam had sprayed from the walls to seal a breach that would have vented the atmosphere into space, and dust hung thick in the air, making it hard to see. Marcus saw the body first. It was a Vethkai, adult, and she was clearly dead, and her mantis-like form lay twisted at an angle that told him her spine had been broken by the falling debris, and her compound eyes stared at nothing, and her forearms were stretched toward something she had been trying to reach when she died. That was when he heard the sound. It was high and keening, and it wavered like a cry, and it came from beneath a pile of collapsed ceiling panels near the dead caretaker, and Marcus felt his stomach drop, because he knew what that sound was, even though he had never heard it before. A child was crying. He crossed the room without thinking and began pulling away debris with his bare hands, and his gloves tore on the sharp metal edges, but he did not stop until he had cleared enough to see what lay beneath the Vethkai child was small, and she could not have been more than a few years old by human standards, and her carapace was pale blue instead of the dark red or black of the adults he had fought, and her 4 eyes were huge and wet and filled with a terror that needed no translation. She was trapped, and her lower body was pinned beneath a beam that Marcus could barely lift, and she made that keening sound again, and her small clawed hands reached toward him. Marcus had killed Vethkai before, and he had watched them kill humans, and he carried scars from 3 years of brutal warfare, and everything he had been taught told him these creatures were the enemy, and they would show him no mercy if the situation were reversed. But she was just a child. She was scared and alone, and her caretaker was dead, and she did not understand what was happening. And she was reaching for anyone who might help her. Marcus set down his rifle. He gripped the beam with both hands, and he pulled with everything he had, and the metal groaned and shifted, and the child screamed as the weight moved, and Marcus roared with effort as he lifted the beam just enough for her to crawl free. She scrambled out and collapsed on the floor, trembling, and Marcus let the beam drop, and he stood there, breathing hard and staring at this small alien creature who looked up at him with 4 terrified eyes. He should leave her, and he knew this, and his squad was somewhere on this station, and they needed him, and staying here was suicide, and she was Vethkai, and her people would not hesitate to kill a human child. Instead, he knelt down beside her. "Hey," he said softly, even though he knew she could not understand him. "Hey, it is okay, and you are okay now, and I am not going to hurt you." The child flinched at the sound of his voice, but she did not run, and she stared at him with those huge pale eyes, and her small body shook with fear. Marcus reached up and unclipped his thermal blanket from his pack, and he wrapped it around her gently, and she grabbed the edges with her clawed hands and pulled it tight around herself like it was the only safe thing in the universe. "Come on," he said, and he picked her up carefully, and she was lighter than he expected. "Let us get you out of here." He carried her through the corridors with his rifle slung across his back, and he moved as quietly as he could, and he checked every corner before advancing, and the child pressed her face against his chest and made small clicking sounds that might have been sobs. The escape pods were 3 sections away, and Marcus knew the route, and he moved as fast as he dared, and twice he had to hide in doorways as Vethkai patrols passed nearby, and each time he pressed himself against the wall with the child clutched to his chest, and each time they passed without seeing him. He was almost there when they found him. 6 Vethkai warriors appeared at the end of the corridor, and their weapons came up instantly, and Marcus knew he could not fight them while holding the child, and he could not reach his rifle, and he could not run. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He turned his body to shield the child, and he waited to die. The warriors shouted in their clicking language, and their weapons were aimed at his back, and Marcus closed his eyes and held the child tighter, and he thought about his mother and his home, and the sky above the farm where he grew up. The killing shot never came. Instead, he heard a new voice, and this one was female, and it carried authority, and the other warriors fell silent immediately, and Marcus heard footsteps approaching, and he opened his eyes and turned his head to see a Vethkai female stood before him, and she was larger than the others, and her chitin was scarred from many battles, and she wore the insignia of a high-ranking commander, and her red, compound eyes were fixed not on Marcus, but on the child in his arms. She spoke a single word, and the child lifted her head and responded with a weak cry, and the female commander went very still. Marcus did not understand what passed between them, but he understood enough, and he slowly knelt down and set the child on the floor, and she ran to the female commander, and the commander caught her with 2 arms while keeping her other 2 hands on her weapon. Marcus stood and faced the commander, and he expected her to shoot him now that the child was safe, but she did not, and she simply stared at him with those alien eyes, and something flickered across her face that he could not read. Then she barked an order, and the warriors lowered their weapons, and they parted to let him pass, and Marcus walked through them on legs that felt like water, and he did not look back. He reached the Terran evac shuttle with minutes to spare, and he collapsed into a seat as the ship pulled away from the dying station, and he told no one what had happened because he did not think anyone would believe him. He never learned the child's name. He never saw the commander's face again. He thought it was over. He was wrong. High Matriarch Vethrala had commanded fleets, and she had conquered worlds, and she had stood before the Supreme Council of the Dominion without fear, but nothing in her long career had prepared her for this moment. Her daughter was Alakitha was alive, and she was wrapped in a strange silver blanket that smelled of alien chemicals, and she clung to Vethrala with all 4 of her small arms, and she would not let go. And she made sounds that broke something deep inside her mother's chest. Station was being evacuated now, and the battle was over, and the humans had retreated, and Vethrala stood in the wreckage of the nursery, where she had hidden her daughter, and she looked at the body of the caretaker she had trusted, and she felt a rage that had no target. What happened? She asked her daughter softly. "Tell me what happened, little one." But Keitha would not speak, and she only pressed her face harder against her mother's chest, and her body trembled with a fear that would not fade, The medics examined her, and they said she was not injured, and they said the trauma was emotional and not physical, and they said she needed rest and safety and time. But Vethrala was a commander. As she needed answers, she questioned the warriors who had found her daughter, and she demanded to know every detail of what they had seen, and they told her a story that made no sense. A human soldier had been carrying Keitha through the corridors, and he had been moving toward the escape pods, and when they had cornered him, he had turned his body to shield the child, instead of using her as a hostage or bargaining chip, and he had simply waited to Vethrala made them repeat this account 3 times, and each time the details remained the same, and she could not understand what she was hearing. Humans did not do this. Humans were predators, and they were pack hunters, and they chased their prey across endless distances until it collapsed from exhaustion, and they formed bonds with other species, only to exploit them, and they were cunning and brutal, and they showed no mercy to Vethkai warriors or civilians. This was what Vethrala had been taught, and this was what she had believed for her entire military career, and this was what every report and every briefing and every piece of propaganda had told her. But a human had saved her daughter. A human had pulled Keitha from the wreckage and wrapped her in his own thermal blanket and carried her towards safety. And when he was trapped, he had chosen to protect her with his body rather than save himself. It made no sense. Over the following weeks, Vethrala found herself unable to stop thinking about the human soldier, and she replayed the moment. She had seen him in her mind over and over, and she remembered the look in his strange flat eyes when he had faced her without weapons and without hope. He had been afraid, but he had not begged, and he had not threatened, and he had simply stood there with his body between her warriors and her child. Why would he do this? Vethrala began her research quietly, because she did not want her superiors to know how deeply this incident had affected her. And she accessed the military databases that contained information about human culture and biology and behavior. And she read everything she could find. The more she read, the more confused she became. Humans, she learned, would adopt the offspring of other species and raise them as their own children. And they did this not for any practical purpose, but simply because they wanted to care for small helpless things, and they called this behavior compassion, and they considered it a virtue. Humans formed emotional bonds with creatures that could not speak and could not reciprocate their affection, and they kept these creatures in their homes and fed them and protected them and mourned them when they died, and they called these creatures pets. But they loved them like family. Humans had been known to risk their lives for complete strangers, and they did this even when there was no reward and no recognition and no logical reason, and their literature was filled with stories of sacrifice and protection and the defense of the innocent. The innocent, that word appeared again and again in the human records, and Vethrala came to understand that it held deep meaning for them, and that they divided the universe into those who could be held responsible for their actions and those who could not. And children were always innocent regardless of what species they belonged to. This was not how the Vethkai thought. To the Vethkai, a child was simply an immature member of a bloodline, and the child of an enemy was a future enemy, and there was no special category of protection for the young and the helpless, because such protection was the responsibility of the bloodline alone. But humans protected all children, and this human had protected Keitha, even though Keitha was Vethkai, and even though her people were killing his people at that very moment. Vithrael requested access to the prisoner records, and she found a way to interview captured human soldiers, and she offered them better treatment in exchange for answers to her questions, and most of them were suspicious, but some of them talked. She asked them about children, and about protection, and about why a soldier would risk his life for an enemy child, and their answers disturbed her profoundly, because she was just a kid. One prisoner said, and he looked at Vethrala like she was insane for even asking, "What else would I do and leave her there to die? She was your enemy." Vethrala pressed, "She was a child," the prisoner replied, and his voice was hard with conviction. Children are not enemies, and children are just children. Vethrala returned to her quarters that night, and she found Keitha awake and crying again, and her daughter had not slept properly since the station, and she refused to let go of the silver blanket, and she drew the same picture over and over with her small clawed hands. The picture showed a figure with 2 arms and 2 legs and flat eyes and pale skin, and the figure was always reaching towards something small and blue. "Who is that?" Vethrala asked, even though she already knew. "The soft one," Keitha whispered, and these were the first words she had spoken in days. "The soft one who carried me, and he was warm, and he did not hurt me. And where is he, mother? And I want to see him again." Vethrala felt something crack inside her chest. Daughter had been saved by a human, and now her daughter was haunted by that human. And the healers said this was something humans called a trauma bond, and they said the only way to heal it might be to see the soft one again. Vethrala was a high matriarch of the Vethkai Dominion, and she had responsibilities and duties, and she could not simply search for one human soldier among billions, but she could not watch her daughter suffer. Either she made a decision that night, and she knew it could end her career, and she knew it could be seen as treason, but she made it anyway. Because she was a mother before she was a commander, she would find the human who had saved her daughter. She did not know yet whether she wanted to thank him or kill him for what he had done to her understanding of the universe, but she knew that she had to find him, and she knew that when she did, everything would change. Marcus Cole had left the war behind, or at least he had tried to leave it behind. He worked construction now on the colony world called Haven's Rest, and he helped build agricultural domes that would grow food for the settlers, and he woke up each morning without the sound of weapons fire, and he went to sleep each night without the fear of death. It was supposed to be peaceful, and it was supposed to be healing, and most days Marcus could almost convince himself that the war was a distant memory that belonged to someone else. But some nights he still dreamed of the station, and he dreamed of pale blue eyes looking up at him and small clawed hands reaching for help, and he woke up with his heart pounding and his hands shaking, and he could not forget. He had never told anyone about the child. His squad members had asked where he had been during the evacuation, and he had said he got lost in the civilian sectors, and they had accepted this because stranger things happened in war, and no one questioned a survivor's story too closely. But Marcus carried the memory with him like a weight in his chest, and he wondered sometimes what had happened to the small blue child, and whether she was safe, and whether she remembered him at all. He was working on the irrigation systems for Dome 7 when his supervisor called him into the office and told him that some government people wanted to talk to him, and Marcus felt the old fear rise up in his chest because government people never brought good news. The woman who met him wore the uniform of Terran intelligence, and her name was Director Chun, and she looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. "Sergeant Cole," she said, and Marcus did not correct her about the rank he no longer held. "Something unusual is happening, and we think you might be able to explain it." She showed him the recordings. Vethkai scout ships had been appearing at the edge of Terran space for the past 3 weeks, and they were not attacking, and they were not scouting military targets, and instead they were broadcasting messages on all frequencies, and the messages were requests or information. They were looking for a specific human soldier, and the description they provided matched Marcus exactly. Height and build and hair color and eye color, and even the scar on his left cheek from a piece of shrapnel on some forgotten battlefield, and they were looking for the human who had been on Kethra Station and who had carried a blue child through the corridors. "That is you," Director Chun said, and it was not a question. "You want to tell me what happened on that station?" Marcus told her. He told her about the collapsed nursery, and the dead caretaker, and the child trapped beneath the debris, and he told her about carrying the child toward the escape pods and being cornered by Vethkai warriors, and he told her about the female commander who would let him go. Director Chun listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The HFY have sent a formal communication, she said finally. It came through diplomatic channels we did not even know existed, and it is addressed to us, but it is really meant for you. She played the message. The voice was female, and it spoke English that was clearly translated by a machine, and the words were strange and formal, but the meaning was clear. The mother of the blue child seeks the shielding one, and no harm is intended, and a debt is owed. And, by the laws of our people, the shielding one has earned the right of audience. And we ask that he be permitted to meet with us. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet. The mother, he said quietly. The commander who let me go, and that was her mother. High Matriarch Vethrala, Director Chun confirmed. One of the most decorated military leaders in the HFY Dominion, and her daughter was hidden on Kethra Station for safety during what was supposed to be a brief engagement, and you saved that child's life. Marcus sat down heavily because his legs would not hold him anymore. What do they want? He asked. We do not know. Director Chun admitted. This is unprecedented, and the HFY do not negotiate, and they do not ask for meetings, and they certainly do not send messages. Talking about debts owed, and yet here we are. She leaned forward, and her eyes were intense. We have been fighting this war for 3 years, and we have lost millions of lives, and we have no idea how to end it. And now suddenly, a HFY High Matriarch is reaching out, and she is reaching out because of something you did, and we need to know what this means. Marcus thought about the child and her pale blue eyes, and the way she had grabbed his thermal blanket, like it was the only safe thing in the universe, and he thought about her mother's face when she had seen her daughter in his arms. I will go, he said. Director Chun blinked. You will what? I will go and meet with her, and if there is even a chance this could help end the war, then I have to try. You could be walking into a trap. I could be, Marcus agreed, but I do not think I am. And I saw her face when she found her daughter, and that was not the face of someone planning revenge. The arrangements took 2 weeks, and there were arguments at the highest levels of government, and some people called Marcus a traitor, and others called him a hero, and most people did not know what to call him at all. But in the end, they let him go. He was transported to a neutral station in the demilitarized zone, and he waited in a bare room with no weapons and no guards, and no way to escape if things went wrong, and he waited because that was all he could do. The door opened and Vethrala entered. She was even more imposing than he remembered, and she stood nearly 8 feet tall, and her chiton was dark red and covered with the scars of many battles, and her compound eyes glittered like rubies in the dim light. But Marcus was not looking at her. He was looking at the small figure that clung to her leg and peered around with 4 wide, pale blue eyes. Kitha saw him, and she made a sound that Marcus remembered from the station, and it was high and keening, but this time it was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of recognition. She released her mother's leg, and she ran across the room, and her small clawed hands grabbed at Marcus's legs, and she looked up at him with those pale eyes, and she said something in her own language that he could not understand. Marcus knelt down so that he was at her level, and he did not know what to say, and he did not know what to do. And so he simply held out his hand. Kitha grabbed it with both of her small hands, and she held on tight. She has not spoken since you left her, Vidrula said, and her voice was strange through the translator. She draws your face, and she refuses to sleep without your thermal cloth, and the healers say she formed a bond with you. Marcus looked at the child, and then at the mother, and he saw something in those alien eyes that he recognized even across the vast gulf between their species. He saw a mother's fear, and a mother's love, and a mother's desperate hope. I could not leave her, Marcus said simply. She was just a kid, and she was scared and alone, and I could not leave her there. She is HFY, Vethrala said. We are your enemies, and we have killed your people, and your people have killed ours, and why would you save the child of your enemy? Marcus thought about the question. And he thought about all the reasons he could give, and all the explanations that might make sense to an alien mind. And in the end he decided that the truth was the only answer worth giving, because she was scared. He said, because she was alone and because that was all that mattered. Vethrala was silent for a long moment, and her eyes never left his face, and Marcus could not read her expression, but he thought he saw something shift behind those compound eyes. This is what I do not understand about your kind, she said. Finally, Marcus looked down at Kitha, who was still holding his hand and who was looking up at him like he was the only safe thing in the universe, and he thought about all the things he did not understand about his own kind. Sometimes, he said quietly, neither do I. The days on the neutral station passed slowly, and Marcus found himself learning things about the Vethkai that no human had ever known before. A Vethrola visited him every day, and sometimes she brought Kitha, and sometimes she came alone, and they talked through the translator about things that should have been impossible for enemies to discuss. She told him about Varakath. It is the oldest law of our people, she explained, and her voice carried a weight that even the translator could not disguise. When one saves the life of another's offspring, a bond is created that transcends all other obligations, and it is deeper than alliance and stronger than oath. Marcus listened and tried to understand. In the ancient times, before we had ships and before we had cities, we had only our bloodlines, and the protection of children was the most sacred duty. And if a stranger saved the child, then that stranger became kin, and this was law. Kin. Marcus repeated. What does that mean exactly? Vethrala's mandibles clicked in. What Marcus had learned was a sign of complex emotion. It means you are bound to my bloodline, and I am bound to protect you, and any debt I hold you hold, and any honor I claim you claim, and this cannot be undone. Marcus sat back in his chair and tried to process what he was hearing. You are saying that because I saved Kitha, I am now part of your family. That is an imperfect translation, but yes, and by our oldest laws you are Rakthorl, and you are the one who shields, and you have earned a place among us. Marcus thought about this, and he thought about what it meant. And he thought about the war that had killed millions and the hatred that had burned between their species for 3 years. Your people would never accept this, he said finally. No. Vethrala agreed, and there was something like sadness in her voice. They would not, and the Dominion does not honor the old laws the way it once did, and there are those who would see this as weakness, and there are those who would call for my execution if they knew what I was telling you. Then why tell me? Vethrala was silent for a long moment, and her compound eyes stared at something Marcus could not see. Because my daughter speaks now, she said quietly. She asks questions, and she laughs again, and she sleeps without screaming. And this is because of you, and I cannot deny what you have done, and I cannot pretend the old laws do not exist. She looked at him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that cut through all the differences between their species. And because I have begun to wonder if everything we were told about humans was a lie. Over the following days, Vethrala shared more with Marcus than any Vethkai had ever shared with a human, and she told him about her people and their culture and their fears, and she told him about the war. She told him about the faction within the Dominion that profited from conflict, and the leaders who had manipulated both sides into fighting, and the original territorial dispute that could have been resolved with words instead of weapons. There are those among my people who want peace, she said, but they are afraid to speak, and the war has given power to those who crave power, and they will not let it end while they can still benefit from it. Marcus understood, because there were humans like that too. It is the same with us, he admitted. There are people who have built their careers on this war, and they will fight any attempt to end it because peace would take away their purpose. Vethrala made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. Then we are not so different. After all, Kitha spent more time with Marcus as the days passed, and she asked him endless questions through a translation device her mother had brought, and she wanted to know everything about humans. "Why is your skin so soft?" she asked, and Marcus told her that humans did not have exoskeletons and their skin was exposed to the world, and she found this terrifying and fascinating and equal measure. "Why do you only have 2 eyes?" she asked, and Marcus told her that 2 eyes were enough for humans to see what they needed to see, and she said this was very sad because she could see in all directions at once. "Why did you carry me?" she asked, and this question was different from the others, and her voice was small and uncertain. When she asked it, Marcus thought about his answer for a long time. "Because you needed help," he said finally, "and because I could help and because it was the right thing to do." "But I am Vethkai," Keitha said, and she sounded confused. "Your people and my people are enemies. You were not my enemy. You were just," said gently, "you were just a scared little girl who needed someone to help her, and that is all I saw when I found you." Keitha was quiet for a moment, and then she climbed into his lap and wrapped her 4 arms around him, and she held on tight. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered. Marcus felt his throat tighten, and he held her carefully, and he thought about how strange the universe was, and how enemies could become family in the space of a single moment. Bethral watched them, and her eyes held something that Marcus could not name, but he thought it might be hope. "You have shown me something I did not believe was possible," she said. "You have shown me that humans can see beyond the boundaries of species, and that you can protect those who are not your own. And this is not what we were taught." "What were you taught?" Marcus asked. "That humans are predators and that you hunt without mercy, and that you bond with other species only to use them, and that you cannot be trusted and cannot be reasoned with." Marcus thought about the war and the things he had seen and the things he had done, and he could not entirely disagree with some of that description. "We can be all of those things," he admitted, "but we can also be more, and sometimes we surprise even ourselves." Vethrala moved closer, and she knelt down so that she was at Marcus's level, and her eyes were very close to his. "I want to end this war," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I have seen what it costs, and I have seen what it takes from us, and I do not want my daughter to grow up in a universe where she must hate humans." Marcus looked at Keitha, who was still in his lap, and who was looking up at him with those pale blue eyes. "Neither do I," he said. "Tell me what I can do to help." Bethrala reached out and placed one of her clawed hands on his shoulder, and the gesture was awkward because her body was not made for such contact. But the meaning was clear. "You have already done more than you know," she said. "But if we are to have any chance, we will need to do much more, and we will need to be very brave and very clever. And we will need to trust each other." Marcus looked at this alien commander who had been his enemy, and who was now something else entirely, and he made a decision. "I trust you," he said. Simplavethrila's mandibles clicked and her eyes brightened, and she said something in her own language that the translator did not catch, but Marcus understood anyway. They were going to try to end the war. The story spread faster than either of them could have imagined. Someone on the neutral station had leaked the details, and within days, the tale of the human soldier and the Vethkai child was being told across both civilizations, and people who had never questioned the war were suddenly asking questions they had never thought to ask. How could humans be mindless predators if one of them had risked his life to save an enemy child? How could the Vethkai be heartless monsters if a high matriarch had crossed enemy lines to honor a debt of gratitude? The governments on both sides tried to control the narrative, and they tried to dismiss the story as propaganda or exaggeration, but too many people had seen the evidence, and too many people wanted to believe that peace was possible. Protests began on human worlds, and citizens demanded to know why the war was still being fought, and they held up images of Marcus and Keitha, and they asked their leaders to explain how monsters could show such compassion on Vethkai worlds. The questions were different, but equally dangerous, and warriors who had lost friends and family began to wonder if they had been lied to, and they began to ask their commanders why they were fighting. an enemy that would protect Vethkai children. The pressure became impossible to ignore. A joint council was called, and it was held on the neutral station where Marcus and Vethrola had first spoken, and representatives from both species gathered. In a great hall that had been designed to accommodate their different bodies and different needs, Marcus stood on one side of the hall with the human delegation, and Vethrola stood on the other side with the Vethkai delegation, and between them sat Kitha, who refused to choose one side or the other, and who held Marcus's thermal blanket in her small clawed hands. The session was tense, and old hatreds ran deep, and there were accusations and denials and bitter words that threatened to destroy any chance of peace before it could begin. But then Marcus was asked to speak. He stood before the assembled leaders of two civilizations, and he looked at their faces, and he saw fear and anger and suspicion, and he also saw something else beneath all of that. He saw exhaustion. These people were tired of war, and they were tired of death, and they were tired of hating, and they were looking for a reason to stop. "I am not a diplomat," Marcus began, "and I am not a politician, and I am just a soldier who got lost on a space station and found a scared little girl who needed help." He looked at Kitha, and she looked back at him with her pale blue eyes. "I did not save her because she was Vethkai or because she was not Vethkai, and I saved her because she was a child who was alone and afraid, and because helping her was the only choice I could live with." He turned to face the Vethkai delegation. "If you protect your children the way we protect ours, then we are not as different as we thought. And if your mothers love their daughters the way our mothers love theirs, then we have something in common that matters more than all the things that divide us." The hall was silent, and Marcus could feel the weight of every eye upon him, and he knew that his next words could determine the fate of billions. "I do not know how to end this war," he said honestly, "but I know that it has to end, and I know that we have to find a way to see each other as something other than enemies, and maybe the way to start is to remember that we are all just people trying to protect the ones we love." Vethrola rose from her seat, and she crossed the hall, and she stood beside Marcus, and the human and Vethkai delegations watched in stunned silence. "This human did what our warriors would do for Vethkai Young," she said, and her translator carried her words to every ear in the room. "He has earned Varakath, and by our oldest laws, he is kin to my bloodline. And if he is kin to me, then perhaps our kinds are kin as well." She reached out and placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he reached up and placed his hand on her arm, and the gesture was awkward and strange, but the meaning was clear to everyone who watched. "We propose a new law," Vethrola continued, "a law that both species will honor, and a law that will bind us together in protection of the innocent." The treaty that emerged was imperfect, and there were arguments and compromises and provisions that neither side was entirely happy with, but at its heart was a simple principle. Any combatant of either species who protected the children of the other would be granted full immunity and honored status, and the protection of the innocent would transcend war. They called it the Shielding Accord. The war did not end overnight, and old wounds took years to heal, and there were those on both sides who fought against peace with everything they had. But the tide had turned, and it could not be turned back, because the story of Marcus and Kitha had given people something to believe in, and it had shown them that compassion was not weakness, and that mercy was not surrender, and that the bonds between protector and protected could bridge any divide. Years later, Marcus stood on the surface of Vethrala's homeworld, and he watched the twin suns set over a city that had never known human footsteps before, and he waited in a garden that smelled of copper, and something sweet Kitha found him there. She was nearly grown now, and her carapace had deepened to a rich azure, and her 4 eyes were bright with intelligence, and she moved with a grace that reminded Marcus of her mother. She was studying xenolinguistics, and she wanted to be a translator, and she wanted to spend her life building bridges between the species that had once tried to destroy each other. She saw Marcus, and she crossed the garden with quick steps, and she wrapped all 4 of her arms around him. And she held on tight. "Ragthorol," she said, and the word needed no translation because Marcus had learned what it meant long ago. Just doing what anyone would do. He said. Keitha pulled back and looked at him with those pale blue eyes that he remembered so well. "That is not true," she said. "Not anyone would do what you did, and that is what makes you special, and that is what makes humans special." Vethrala approached them, and she moved more slowly now, and there was gray in her chitin that had not been there before, but her eyes were still sharp, and her spirit was still strong. She clicked her mandibles in the Vethkai expression of deep affection, and she looked at Marcus with something that might have been love, you know. She said, "When I first began searching for you, I did not know if I wanted to thank you or kill you for what you had done to my understanding of the universe." Marcus smiled, and he remembered standing in that corridor on Kethra Station with weapons pointed at his back and a small blue child clutched to his chest. And now, he asked. Vethrala reached out and she took his hand in her clawed fingers, and she held it gently. "Now I understand why the universe brought us together, and now I am grateful for every moment since, and now I know that there is nothing more terrifying in all the cosmos than a human who decides to protect something." She leaned closer, and her eyes glittered in the fading light. Because when humans decide to protect something, they do not stop, and they do not give up, and they do not care what stands in their way, and that is what makes your kind extraordinary. Marcus looked at Vethrala, and he looked at Keitha, and he thought about all the lives that had been changed, because one soldier had refused to leave a scared child behind. "We are just doing what feels right," he said simply. Vethrala clicked her mandibles again, and there was warmth in the sound. "That is what makes it terrifying," she said. "You believe that, and sometimes you make us believe it too." Above them, the twin suns disappeared below the horizon, and the stars came out one by one, and somewhere in that vast darkness, 2 civilizations were learning to see each other as something other than enemies. And it had all started with one human who had decided that a scared child mattered more than a war.